From the Congressional Record Online through the Government Publishing Office. Mr. Weldon speaking, from Florida. In January of this year, the Department of Health and Human Services sent out an autism alert to the nation's pediatricians. In this alarm, they stated that 1 in every 167 children is being diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. I will repeat that. 1 in every 167 children being born in the United States today is being diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. Furthermore, 1 in 7 children is being diagnosed with either a learning disability or a behavioral disability. Mr. Speaker, something dreadful is happening to our youngest generation, and we must sound the alarm and figure out what is going on with our children. I had the pleasure of addressing an autism conference in Chicago last month, and I would like to share today some of the thoughts I shared then with about 1,000 researchers, doctors, nurses, educators, and most importantly, parents who were there to seek answers to this growing problem. I've said repeatedly that the autism community is the 900-pound gorilla that has not had its voice properly heard on Capitol Hill. This is largely due to the endless demands on the time, effort, emotions, and financial resources of the parents of these children who are struggling to meet the unique needs of these kids with autism. There is little time, money, energy left to engage in public debates, let alone engage the Congress when one is trying to raise a child with a disability like autism. However, I see that changing, and last month's Institute of Medicine report, I think, has had one positive effect. It has united and reinvigorated parents throughout the country in their efforts to get answers to why children are being diagnosed with autism at such a high rate in the United States. At the outset of my remarks, I want to make it extremely clear that I support vaccinations. I have a 6-year-old son. He has received all of his vaccinations. Someone in the media recently tried to portray me as a vaccine skeptic. After reviewing my record on this issue and all of my statements in the past, the newspaper printed a retraction. This, however, seems to be part of the pattern, to vilify those who simply ask if our vaccines could be made safer. I support vaccinations, and indeed I gave vaccinations to thousands of my patients when I was practicing medicine full-time prior to coming to the U.S. House. However, I believe it is appropriate to acknowledge that, like with any other medical intervention, different individuals respond differently. We're all unique. We all have different genetic makeup, and what may cause no harm to the vast majority of people can cause serious side effects in some individuals. Since we established the National Vaccine Compensation Program in the late 1980s, several thousand individuals have been compensated for vaccine injuries. We know that there are adverse reactions, and I believe it is important that we dedicate resources to better understand why some children have these reactions. For too long, those who run our national vaccination program have viewed those who have adverse reactions, including those with severe adverse reactions, as the cost of doing business. Furthermore, the vaccine compensation program, which was designed to be a no-fault compensation system, has become so adversarial that only the most obvious cases receive compensation, and too many parents feel that the program is not worth the difficulty of going through it. The questions I raise are multiple. The number one question has been whether neurological problems were caused in some children by the high levels of mercury-containing additive that was included in our vaccines in the 1990s. This mercury-containing additive is called Thimerosal, and in the 1990s, infants and unborn children were exposed to significant amounts of mercury at the most critical point in their development. Now, this recent Institute of Medicine report, what exactly is wrong with it? What about it has so many people in the autism community upset? In my 10 years of service in the U.S. Congress, I have never seen a report so badly miss the mark. I have heard some weak arguments here in Washington, D.C., and I can tell my colleagues that the arguments put forward in this IOM report are indeed very weak. Let us examine the report in some detail. On January 15th of this year, I wrote Dr. Julie Gerberding, the director of CDC. and I asked her to postpone the February 9th Institute of Medicine meeting and this report because of my concern that this was not an exercise in discovering the truth, but was instead a meeting, and I will quote that I said in my letter, being driven by a desire to short-circuit important research and draw premature conclusions. I said, if the purpose of this meeting is to seriously consider and address these concerns, then this will not be accomplished. Quoting further from my letter to Dr. Gerberding, I said, it appears to me, not only as a member of Congress, but also as a physician, that some officials within the CDC's National Immunization Program, the NIP, may be more interested in a public relations campaign than getting to the truth about thimerosal. End quote. I said, pressing forward with this meeting at this time, I believe, will further undermine the credibility of the CDC on matters of vaccine safety and do damage to the reputation of the Institute of Medicine. I believe the proposed date of this meeting, which you have the ability to change, is in the best interest of no one who is seeking the truth about a possible association between vaccines and neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism. Now, I had a follow-up conversation on February 3rd of this year with Dr. Gerberding, and she assured me that the Institute of Medicine's February meeting was not an attempt to draw conclusions, but merely to update the science of where we are, basically. However, it is clear that this report draws conclusions, and what is perhaps the greatest outrage, it goes further to call for the halt of further research. A public relations campaign rather than sound science seems to be the modus operandi for officials at the CDC's National Immunization Program. Why do I say this? Let us look not only at the timing of the IOM meeting in February, the content of the IOM report, but also at studies the IOM used as a basis for their decision. The IOM bases their decision almost entirely on 5 epidemiologic studies. Epidemiology is essentially the statistical analysis of disease in populations. All of these studies were conducted by researchers with an interest in not finding an association. All of the studies had significant shortcomings, all of which the IOM itself declares would miss the association with autism in genetically acceptable subset of children. Not only the timing of the IOM meeting raises questions, but also the narrowing of the scope of inquiry and the emphasis the IOM placed just on epidemiology. In 2001, the IOM concludes, exposure to thimerosal containing vaccines could be associated with neurodevelopmental disorders. The IOM also recommended that children not be given mercury-containing vaccines. What was the response of the CDC? For this most recent report, they narrowed the IOM scope to look just at autism. Does that sound like an agency interested in whether or not thimerosal is harmful to some children? Or does this response lead one to conclude that they are more interested in designing something to reassure an increasingly skeptical public? Unlike 2001, this time the IOM was directed by the CDC to only consider the possible relationship between thimerosal and autism, rather than neurodevelopmental disorders as a whole. Anyone familiar with the Verstraeten study, a study published looking at thimerosal and autism, knows exactly why the IOM scope was narrow. Because the 2003 Verstraeten study found associations between thimerosal and neurodevelopmental disorders in some children with autism may have been misdiagnosed as having speech or language delay. By narrowing the scope, which largely went unnoticed by the media, the CDC has avoided acknowledging that thimerosal very well might have caused neurodevelopmental disorders in some children. This latest IOM report is simply part of a PR campaign, in my view. Would we not have had much more production in our report if the CDC had updated the research on possible associations between thimerosal and neurodevelopmental disorders as a whole? In evaluating thimerosal's relationship to autism, the IOM relies almost exclusively on these 5 epidemiologic studies. The principal authors of all 5 of these studies have serious conflicts of interest. All 5 studies were published in 2003, leading up to the IOM's February 2004 meeting. All were conducted while the CDC and the NIH virtually ignored the IOM's 2001 biological and clinical research recommendations. It is critical to note the instructions that the IOM was given, primarily by the CDC, which has been funding the IOM. Pages 5 and 6 of the IOM report make it clear that epidemiology was to reign supreme. In the absence of epidemiologic evidence to support causality, the IOM was instructed to give biological evidence little consideration and was prohibited from allowing biological evidence to lend evidence towards causality. Is it any wonder that the CDC has spent the past 2 years dedicating significant funding to epidemiology while starving funding for clinical and biological research? The IOM notes in their report that the epidemiologic studies they examined were not designed to pick up a genetically susceptible population, and this is the very theory of the link between thimerosal and autism spectrum disorders. 1 in 167 become autistic. Why do the other 166 not? It is because they do not have the impaired ability to eliminate mercury from their system. We are looking at a genetically susceptible subpopulation, yet these studies that they base this report on, they admit, were not capable of picking up these subsets in the populations. Let us look at these studies. The only study done in the United States, the Verstraeten study, was published in the Journal of Pediatrics in November of last year. Much has been written exposing the study's methodological problems, findings, and conclusions. Most importantly, however, is that this study did not compare children who got thimerosal to those who did not. Instead, its CDC-employed authors focused primarily on what is called a dose-response gradient. Those who got less thimerosal later in life had less autism, is the theory behind the study. In addition to the study itself, it is important to note the public relations spin surrounding the study. On the day the Verstraeten study was released, a top CDC researcher and co-author of the study was quick to declare to the news media, the final results of the study show no statistical association between thimerosal vaccines and harmful health outcomes in children, in particular autism and attention deficit disorder. Let me repeat that. The final results of the study show no statistical association between thimerosal vaccines and harmful health outcomes in children, in particular autism and attention deficit disorder. The newspaper headlines of the day read, "Study clears vaccine containing mercury," the Associated Press and USA Today. "CDC says vaccines are safe," the Seattle Times. While that was the spin of the day, allow me to quote from the study. "We found no consistent, significant associations between thimerosal containing vaccines and neurodevelopmental outcomes. In the first phase of our study, we found an association between exposure to mercury from thimerosal containing vaccines and some of the neurodevelopmental outcomes screened. In this second phase, these associations were not replicated for the most common disorders in an independent population." They did not find associations, but they changed the study. They did find associations, but they changed the study, and most of the associations disappeared. Furthermore, in January 2004, the lead co-author was forced to admit that many children in the study were too young to have received an autism diagnosis. He went on to admit that the study also likely mislabeled young autistic children as having other disabilities, thus masking the number of children with autism. The message from the CDC to the media was that there is nothing to be concerned about, but the study said something different. The news media, to a large degree, took the CDC's spin hook, line, and sinker. Largely, they chose not to read the study itself. 5 months after that study was published in the Journal of Pediatrics, and I might add after the IOM report was largely written, Dr. Thomas Verstraeten broke his silence in a letter to Pediatrics stating, "The bottom line is and has always been the same. An association between thimerosal and neurological outcomes could neither be confirmed nor refuted, and therefore more study is required." This is what Dr. Thomas Verstraeten said. Dr. Verstraeten, the lead author of this study, says that an association between thimerosal-containing vaccines and neurodevelopmental disorders cannot be refuted based on his study. Yet the IOM, in their assessment of that same study, states that it is a basis for concluding, quote, there is no association between thimerosal-containing vaccines and autism, end quote. The IOM acknowledges that Verstraeten would not have picked up an association in a genetically susceptible population. The IOM also noted that the study was limited in its ability to answer whether thimerosal in vaccines causes autism because the study tests a dose-response gradient, not exposure versus no exposure. I might also add, Mr. Speaker, that the Verstraeten study cannot be validated. The earlier data sets have been destroyed, and the only data sets the CDC will make available to outside researchers are the ones they have already manipulated. The raw, unaltered data is not available. Additionally, outside researchers are held to a much more restrictive access to information than are the CDC researchers. Only one independent researcher has been granted access to the CDC's VSD database, and the CDC has kicked that researcher out based on ridiculous reasons. They claim their research methods might infringe on privacy, yet they know the database contains no names and it is impossible to locate the patients from this database. I want to talk briefly about the other 4 studies that the Institute of Medicine based its conclusions on. The IOM cited the 2003 HVID study of the Danish population as one of the key studies upon which it based its conclusions. Let us first consider the conflict of interest of this principal author. Dr. Hvid works for the Danish Epidemiology Science Center, which is housed at the Statens Serum Institute, the government-owned Danish vaccine manufacturer. Also, all of his co-authors either work with him at the center or are employed by the SSI. The SSI, the Statens Serum Institute, makes a considerable profit off the sales of vaccines and vaccine components, and the U.S. is a major market for the SSI. SSI has $120 million in annual revenue, and vaccines are the fastest growing business segment, accounting for 80% of its profits. Both the United States and the United Kingdom are important export markets for SSI vaccines and vaccine components. Furthermore, if Hvid were to find an association between thimerosal and autism, SSI, with which he and his center are affiliated, would then face significant lawsuits. These facts are important and are critical when evaluating Dr. Hvid's work. Furthermore, this study looked at autism and not at neurodevelopmental disorders. The important thing in evaluating the study is that exposure in the Danish population to thimerosal varied considerably from that in the United States. Danish children receive 75 micrograms of mercury in their first 9 weeks of life, and then another 50 grams at 10 months. By comparison, children in the United States receive 187.5 micrograms of mercury by the age of 6 months, nearly 2.5 times as much mercury as the Danish population. Dr. Boyd Haley has said that comparing the exposure of the U.S. children to the children in Denmark is like comparing apples and cows. I think there is a lot of truth to that. Hvid states that the rate of autism went up after they began removing thimerosal from vaccines in 1992. The numbers in Hvid's study were skewed in that they began to add outpatient autism diagnosis after 1992. The IOM notes other limitations of the study, including the differences in the dosing schedule and relative genetic homogeneity of the Danish population. Yet even with all these serious limitations, the IOM felt that the study had strong internal validity. Like the Verstraeten study, Hvid would not be able to pick up a group of children who are genetically susceptible to mercury toxicity, principally because they have impaired ability to excrete mercury. Case in point, Danish autism rates are 6 in 10,000, where in the United States it is less than 1 in 200. I do not believe how they can use a Danish study as a valid conclusion to say that thimerosal did not cause an increase in autism and other autism spectrum disorders and neurodevelopmental disorders in the United States when children in the United States received significantly more mercury exposure. Another study that the Institute of Medicine relied on was the Madsen study. Madsen et al. Once again examined virtually the same population, Danish children who received significantly less than they. Let us consider the conflicts of interest in the Madsen study. First of all, two of Madsen's co-authors are employed by the same Statin Serum Institute. The study, like Havid, added outpatient cases into the number of cases of autism after 1995, a methodological flaw. The authors acknowledged that this addition might have exaggerated the incidence of autism after the removal of autism. The IOM acknowledged this, but yet used the data anyway. Another study the IOM relied on, the Sturr-Green study, examined, guess what, the Danish population again, along with the Swedish population. I will not repeat the problems with the Danish data, but with regard to Sweden, it is important to note that the children there receive even less thimerosal than children in Denmark, receiving only 75 micrograms by 2 years of age versus children in the United States receiving the 187.5 micrograms by 6 months of age. Furthermore, the authors included only inpatient autism diagnosis in the Swedish population. The IOM notes that the ecological nature of this data, quote, limits the study's contribution to causality, end quote, but they cite it anyway. The Miller study, also included in the IOM report, examines the population of children in the United Kingdom. This study is still unpublished, which limits its availability to be examined critically. It is important to note, however, that Dr. Miller has actively campaigned against those who have raised questions about vaccine safety. We have a person here who is actively campaigning, testifying in lawsuits against the theory that thimerosal is linked to neurodevelopmental disorders and autism, doing a study supposedly showing there is no link. So what can we conclude about these 5 epidemiologic studies? We can see clearly why the IOM is on very shaky ground in drawing the conclusion that it did. They based their decision on these 5 studies, 3 of them examining genetically homogeneous children in Denmark. At least one employee of the Statin Serum Institute serves as a co-author on 3 of the studies. Only one study examines the U.S. population, and that study did not compare children who had received mercury with those who had not. 4 of them are studies of children receiving less than half the amount of mercury that U.S. children receive. None of them with any ascertainment of prenatal or postnatal background mercury exposures. None of them considering prenatal exposure which may have been given to the children. None of them have been able to detect a susceptible group in the population. 3 of them failing to address how the addition of outpatient cases of autism in Denmark might have previously skewed their results. 4 of them examined populations with autism rates considerably less than the United States, and one of these studies has never been published. It is impossible to review the data. Might I also add, they are all statistical studies. There have been numerous biological studies suggesting that mercury is linked to autism. Specifically, mercury studies that show after chelation therapy, children with autism excrete a tremendous amount of mercury in their urine, whereas normal children do not. And it is important to note that there was a recent report published by Dr. Emily Garcia Berthal and Dr. Carlos Alcaraz examining statistical errors in medical publications. They found 5 volumes of Nature and 11 volumes of the British Medical Journal. They found 11% of the computations in Nature and the BMJ were incongruent, and at least one statistical error appeared in 38% of the papers. Despite all the biological evidence suggesting there may be a link with thimerosal and autism here, and the obvious knowledge that many of these statistical studies are flawed, the Institute of Medicine concluded, and many people in the press believed it, that there is no link. Mr. Speaker, something needs to be done. The Institute of Medicine report not only looked at the mercury issue, it as well looked at the issue of the safety of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. Many years ago, a researcher in England, a Dr. Andrew Wakefield, published a report suggesting that some children with autism have measles virus growing in their intestines, causing a condition called inflammatory bowel disease. And indeed, there have been recent reports in the medical literature that some of these children have measles virus particles in their cerebral spinal fluid and elevations of a protein called myelin basic protein in their cerebral spinal fluid, suggesting they have an active low-grade encephalitis being caused by measles virus. The IOM was asked to look at this issue. How did they approach this issue? Did they ask for research protocols that attempted to duplicate the Wakefield study? No. What they did was, again, another epidemiologic study. I believe that the CDC's conclusion and the IOM's conclusion on their MMR is as well flawed. I am pleased that finally attempt is underway to duplicate Dr. Wakefield's findings, and hopefully we can get some answers to these questions regarding the safety of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. For the reasons that I have outlined above and other reasons, the Institute of Medicine report, I believe, is premature, perilously reliant on epidemiology, based on preliminary and incomplete information, and I believe may ultimately be repudiated, perhaps in short order. This report will not deter me nor the autism community from our commitment to see that Thimerosal and MMR research is properly done. This report will do nothing to put to rest the concerns of parents who believe their children were harmed by mercury-containing vaccines or the MMR vaccine. While this report will lead many clinicians to believe that Thimerosal is safe and there are no problems with the MMR, it may contribute further to an erosion of the doctor-patient relationship in the United States. This report has dragged the IOM under a cloud of controversy that has currently engulfed the CDC, much like the infamous 1989 study by the National Institute of Child and Human Development, which missed the link between folic acid deficiencies and neural tube defects like spina bifida. The epidemiologic studies reviewed by the IOM in drawing these findings could easily have missed an association in susceptible populations. Finally, let us remember that the IOM is not immune to error and has been forced to reverse itself before. Most recently, the IOM reversed a long-standing finding that chronic lymphocytic leukemia was not due to Agent Orange exposure. A similar reversal is very real and possible here. On April 2nd of this year, I introduced, along with gentlewoman from New York, Miss Maloney, in H.R. 4169, the Mercury-Free Vaccines Act of 2004. We currently have 22 co-sponsors from across the political spectrum. H.R. 4169 will phase out the use of mercury vaccines over the next 3 years, giving particular attention to completely eliminating mercury from childhood vaccines on an expedited schedule. This bill is a response to the fact that the safety of thimerosal and vaccines is not proven. Mercury is a well-established neurotoxin according to the EPA. 1 in 6 newborns is born with a blood mercury level considered unsafe. The FDA and the EPA recently warned pregnant women, nursing mothers, and young children to limit their consumption of certain fish. No one at the NIH or CDC can tell us what happens to mercury once injected into an infant. Where does it go? How much goes to the critical organs? How much to the brain? Can it cause damage to the developing central nervous system? No one has good answers to these questions, and they should have answers to these questions before more infants are exposed to mercury. The CDC has adopted a policy to introduce mercury-containing vaccines to children in the form of flu vaccine, which will be given at 6 months, 7 months, and 23 months of age. Most of the flu vaccine on the market today contains mercury. I believe we need new legislation. It is critical that we pass the Mercury-Free Vaccines Act of 2004. It is critical, I believe, that we make improvements in how we monitor for and respond to adverse reactions to vaccines. Today there are 3 government agencies that have responsibilities related to monitoring the safety of vaccines: the FDA, CDC, and NIH. The Food and Drug Administration has responsibility primarily to make sure that the vaccines are prepared according to specifications. They do operate the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. The NIH does not have a concerted effort to fund vaccine safety research. They provide funding for research in a haphazard manner. If one happens to submit a proposal and it passes peer review, the study may get funded. The NIH has funded only a handful of studies over the past 2 years investigating vaccine safety issues. The CDC has the greatest responsibility in this area. Unfortunately, they have the greatest conflict of interest. The CDC's vaccine safety program amounts to 30 million a year program, and half of it goes to pay HMOs for access to the vaccine safety database. The biggest conflict within the CDC is that they are also responsible for a $1 billion vaccine promotion program. The CDC largely measures its success by high vaccination rates, and here lies the conflict. Any study raising concerns that there might be adverse reactions to some vaccines in some children has the ability to lower vaccine rates, and lower vaccination rates are in direct conflict with the CDC's top measurement of success. Clearly, due to its overwhelming size and the manner in which the agency measures its success, the vaccine promotion program overshadows and influences the CDC's vaccine safety program. In fact, rightly or wrongly, the Vaccine Safety Office within the CDC is largely viewed by outside observers as nothing more than another arm of the vaccine promotion program, giving support to vaccine promotion policies and doing very little to investigate and better understand acute and chronic adverse reactions. Further complicating the CDC's role in undermining the research is the fact that the vaccine safety studies produced by the CDC are impossible to reproduce. External researchers are not granted the same level of access to the raw data sets that the CDC's internal researchers are granted. The bottom line is that the CDC studies related to vaccine safety cannot be validated by external researchers, a critical component in demonstrating the validity of scientific findings. The CDC's recently convened Blue Ribbon panel to examine how the CDC might better review vaccine safety is a step in the right direction. However, I do not hold out much hope because the panel is limited in its scope, much like the IOM was limited in the outcome they were allowed to draw. This panel is limited to deciding where within CDC vaccine safety monitoring should be housed. The NIH recently recognized the importance of moving patient safety monitoring out of the NIH. I believe the same should be done with vaccine monitoring. It should be completely removed from CDC's jurisdiction. The CDC is too conflicted to oversee this function.